Okay, welcome back, folks. Let me get my program up here. Okay, so where are my so there we go. Just got to be smarter than the program, which in my case is not always easy. Okay, welcome back, folks, to the history of the Ozarks, and we have been talking about the Civil War the last few weeks. Today, we're going to do the setup to the most important battle of the Civil War in the Ozarks, which was the Battle of Wilson's Creek. Now, I know some people down in northern Arkansas are probably going to dispute that and say, no, it was Pea Ridge. And, some historians actually believe that. But since I'm doing the presentation, I'm going to say it's the Battle of Wilson's Creek. So we are going to talk about the setup today. And exactly, what precipitated the battle, take you right up to the moment it starts. And then next week, we're actually going to fight the battle. So let's kind of review a little bit. Remember last week, we talked about General Lyon, Nathaniel Lyon from Fort Riley, Kansas, was brought in to guard the federal arsenal south of St. Louis, which was being threatened by Governor Claiborne Fox Jackson and the Missouri militia. They were intending on seizing it. And Lyon, in turn, seized the militia, marched them downtown St. Louis, which ended up in a huge riot, causing him to have his soldiers shoot into the crowd, killing 28 civilians. That, in turn, prompted the Missouri State Legislature meeting in Jefferson City to say, we're going to secede from the Union. So they issued a law saying they were seceding from the Union and immediately fled the capital because they knew Lyon was coming for them. So they head southwest towards Carthage and intending to meet up with a Confederate army that was forming in northern Arkansas, made up of General Ben McCulloch from Texas and General Bart Pierce, who was head of the Arkansas State Militia. And indeed, they do meet up. Now, Lyon, knowing what's happened, because he got spies out there, decides to send a quick group of soldiers down to Springfield. He says he orders them to Springfield, said, go as fast as you can to Springfield and seize Springfield, because Springfield was kind of the key to Southwest Missouri. And he says, if we can get Springfield, we've got some place to kind of launch an attack upon the Southern Army. So they head that way. But then one of the generals decides he's going to go off on his own and be a hero. And he proceeds on to Carthage in an attempt to intercept the Southern Army headed southwest into what was now Cassville. And the result was that FRANZ, a German general from St. Louis under Lyon's command, ends up getting his rear end kicked. And he kind of limps back to Springfield, where he joins up with General Lyon and another general by the name of Sweeney, who sit in Springfield and try to make a decision on what they're going to do next. The governor of Missouri, Jackson, along with Price, the head of the Missouri State Militia, meet up with General McCulloch and General Pierce at Cassville, area known as Cowskin Prairie at that point. So that's the setup. That's where we got. Now, this is our noted Ozarker of the day. Now, I have to tell you, this person is not famous, okay? I've got this picture up here for a reason, and maybe some of you can tell, probably not, but indeed, that's me, okay?
He looks a little bit like.
So let me tell you about this picture, okay? Now today, if I was famous, I'd be canceled because I'm carrying a Confederate flag and I'm wearing a Confederate hat. And oh my gosh, if I was a famous person, I would be absolutely removed from the scene, because you can't do those kind of things today. So let me tell you how this all took place. 1961, summer of 1961. It's the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Wilson's Creek. I lived at Republic, which was about 2 to 3 miles from Wilson's Creek, and had been there all my life, as a child. And so here I am. I've decided I'm going to be a born again rebel, 13 years old. I don't know much about anything. All I know is I want to be a rebel. And so somehow, and I don't know how, I got up enough money to buy me this Confederate flag and get that Confederate hat. And you can obviously tell I'm just as pleased as punch about having that thing. And so one day in the summer, I decide I'm going to go down and visit my grandpa. And I've got this flag and this hat. Now, my grandpa lived about a block and a half from me, and I went down there almost every day to see him. And I just absolutely loved my grandfather. He was just, the most important person in the world to me at that point. And he always sat under a big old tree in his front yard in the afternoons, reading the book, playing his harmonica, smoking his pipe. And I'd walk down there and visit with him for a while and go in to see grandma, and then I'd go back home. So here I go marching into his front yard, and he looks up at me, and folks, it's just, I can see this today. I mean, there were like sparks coming out of his eyes, and his eyes narrowed, and he looked at me, and for whatever reason, and I never understood why, he called me Nani. And he said, Nani, get out of my yard wearing that hat and carrying that flag, and don't ever come back if you have it again. Well, I mean, needless to say, I'm just crushed. And I go back home, and I'm not ashamed to admit it, 13 years old, I went back to my bedroom and just cried my eyes out. And I stayed in there all afternoon. I was just absolutely so upset. And I heard my dad come home, and my mom's in the kitchen. She says, well, you better go in and take care of your son. Said he and his grandpa got in a fight, and said he's upset. So Dad walks in and he says, what happened, son? So I tell him, and he just looks at me, and I'm not going to repeat all the words he said because this is a family show. Okay. Basically, he told me I was an idiot. And he said, don't you realize that your grandpa's dad fought in the Civil War? He lost 2 brothers. He had a cousin that fought in the Civil War that died, and he himself was injured and carried those injuries with him the rest of his life. And your grandpa grew up watching this and hearing this. And it never even dawned on me. It just, history was fun. I loved it. In fact, I think I knew even then I was going to be a history teacher, but it was just something I read about in books. And all of a sudden, folks, it hit me. This is real. This happened to real people. People died carrying that flag and fighting that flag. And I realized right then and there that if I ever got a chance to be a history teacher, I would make sure and always try to personalize it to the point that people would understand it happens to real people, that real people suffered, that real people had anguish over these events. I don't know what I did with that flag and that hat, but I know this: I never carried it again down to my grandpa's. And I went down the next day and we made up. I remember that very clearly. But, that's the reason I show that picture. I want you to understand that my philosophy about history is that I try to make it as real as I can and make people understand that these events happen to real people. So anyway, enough of that, So let's go on. Now, as I've told you, General LYON sends SIGEL, FRANZ SIGEL, he's a German immigrant living in St. Louis, and he's a very educated man, as I'll show you here in a few minutes. He sends him to Springfield, and he ventures off in his own and heads to Carthage. And he gets to Carthage and meets up with General Jackson, the head of Missouri State Militia, and just absolutely gets his rear end kicked and has to limp back to Springfield. I'm sure that General LYON was not happy with Franz Siegel when he got to Springfield, because that's not what he was ordered to do. It is the first large-scale battle of the Civil War in Missouri. Casualty rate was pretty high, and they still honor this battle down in Carthage. And there's a painting of the Battle of Carthage. It happened actually right outside on the southern limits of Carthage, right, instead of right into the middle of the city. Most Civil War battles were fought out in the open. There's a few instances of what we call urban warfare. And one of those incidentally occurred in Springfield in 1862. We'll talk about that in a few weeks. So Lyon gets to Springfield, and he heads in, meets up with General Sweeney and now Franz Siegel. Now, he feared that General Price was going to occupy Springfield. And so he got there ahead of the time. He arrives in Springfield July 13th, 1861. He has a combined army of about somewhere around 5,400 soldiers. Now, that may seem like a lot, but it's not, because the army he's going to face has over 10,000 soldiers at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. He realizes he's outmanned, and he's got spies out there. He's got scouts, and they're telling him how big this army is down around Cassville. So he sends a telegram to General John C. Fremont, who is the head of the Army of the West. He is in charge of all the federal armies west of the Mississippi River. And he requests more troops. He says, hey, General Fremont, I need more soldiers, because I'm going to get into battle here in a few minutes or a few days, and I'm greatly outnumbered. Well, General Fremont, we don't have time to talk about it, but General Fremont was kind of one of these people that was a legend in his own time, in his mind at least. And he was one of these guys that liked to have big armies and liked to put on big shows, but he seemed to always try to avoid a fight. And sure enough, he sent a telegram back to Lyon, says, hey, you're on your own. I can't spare you. I've got to guard St. Louis and guard the Mississippi River. Even though there was no threat at that point of any Confederate army coming towards St. Louis, the army was in Southwest Missouri. And so he says, I can't afford any more troops. You're just going to have to fight it out on your own or come back. The next thing Lyon does, realizing he's going to have to fight this out, he sends General Sweeney to Forsyth, where it's reported that there's a big army forming. He goes to Forsyth, south of Springfield, about 40 miles, finds out there's nothing out there. It's just a little band of Southern sympathizers. Sweeney sends them on the run, reports back to Springfield. So there's John C. Fremont, the old pathfinder, a very famous explorer of the Old West. And he basically tells Lyon, you're on your own. You're going to have to fight this battle by yourself. So what is the Southern Army doing? Well, the Southern Army, as I told you, had organized at the Cowskin Prairie, right around present-day Cassville, Missouri. By the way, Cassville, Missouri is a hot spot in the Civil War in Southwest Missouri. I don't know exactly how many battles they had there, but they had several battles in the Civil War in Cassville. So they have formed at Cassville, and it's a pretty large army. It's actually three separate armies that have come together. You've got General Ben McCulloch, as I mentioned. He's got a Confederate army from Texas that has come up. Pardon here. Got to get myself a bit organized. Okay, so he's got a Confederate army from Texas. You've got Bart Pierce, the head of the Arkansas State Militia. And finally, of course, you have Sterling Price, the Missouri State Militia. Combined, these three armies are over 13,000 soldiers. Remember, I told you Lyon only has about 5,400 soldiers, no more than 6,000. So they're almost tripled, really, what Lyon has. So it's a very much outnumbered army. On top of that, while they're headed towards Springfield, they are met up with a small detachment of cavalry from Texas called the Greer's South Kansas Texas Cavalry. So it's even larger now. So here are these three guys. You got General Ben McCulloch. Ben McCulloch is an old veteran of many, many wars. He's a veteran of the Texas Revolution. He actually went to Texas with Davy Crockett. And if he wouldn't have got sidetracked, he would have been at the Alamo, but he didn't get to the Alamo. So he ended up not being there at that disaster. But he does fight in the Mexican War, and he's a decorated hero in the Mexican War. He becomes one of the original Texas Rangers to guard the state or the country then against Comanche attacks and attacks from the remnants of the Mexican army. And when the Civil War breaks out, they appoint him the head of the Texas State Militia. Eventually, that is absorbed into the Confederate States of America when Texas secedes and joins the CSA, and they put him in charge of the Army of the West. He is the equivalent of John C. Fremont, for the Confederate armies. Very large man, kind of eccentric. He always wore a black velvet suit. Don't ask me why. It seems kind of weird to me, but he was kind of a dandy, apparently. And instead of wearing a uniform or anything, he always wore a black velvet suit and wore the white horse. Come to find out, that probably wasn't a very good idea because it made him a marked man on the battlefield, as you will see, because eventually he was killed at the Battle of Pea Ridge, Arkansas, the next winter by a sniper on the side of the Union Army. For a long time, the rumor was it was Wild Bill Hickok, who was indeed at the Battle of Pea Ridge, that actually killed him. It was not. We know exactly who it was, and it was not Wild Bill Hickok, but that was the legend for a long time. And then there's General Price. General Price is head of the Missouri State Militia. He's an old veteran of the Mexican War, just like McCulloch. He actually had been the former governor of Missouri. His nickname is Pap. Everybody called him Pap Price. He was just a beloved figure in Missouri. I mean, he was one of the most popular figures in the state of Missouri. And he is appointed the head of the Missouri State Militia, and he is the one that basically takes the militia into the Confederacy. Now, he gets in a feud with McCulloch, the guy we just talked about. They don't see eye to eye about tactics. General Price says, hey, we're in Missouri and I ought to be in charge of this. And McCulloch says, well, you're just a militia man. All you've got is a bunch of roastineer foragers. That's what he called the Missouri State Militia. He said, you guys aren't going to fight very much. I'm in charge of this. So you're just going to have to play second fiddle to me. Price did not like that. And in fact, after the Battle of Wilson's Creek, they got in such an argument that Price ends up leaving McCulloch's army and going out on his own, and tries to end up keeping Missouri in the Confederacy. And he just has continual raids back and forth in Missouri all throughout the war. Finally ends up getting defeated at the Battle of Westport in 1864. Westport's now Kansas City. He was one of the last generals to surrender. He actually went to Mexico rather than surrender, and he and some other defeated Confederate generals went there with the intent to kind of start their own country. Turned out he got sick, got cholera, came back to Missouri, ended up dying in St. Louis in 1866, about a year and a half after the war was over. And then there was General Bart Pierce, who was the head of the Arkansas State Militia. He's the equivalent of General Price in Arkansas. He, just like Price, did not like being absorbed into the Confederate Army. He said, hey, I'm in charge of Arkansas troops, not you. And just like Price, they got into a little bit of an argument. As it turned out, his army was absorbed into the Confederacy, and he kind of was punished because of his argumentation with McCulloch. Ends up becoming a commissary for the war, all throughout the war. That basically means he was in charge of making sure supplies were given out correctly. He was kind of removed from the battlefield. He was actually a pretty good general. Died in Dallas, Texas, after a long career as a teacher and a business leader. So that's the three Confederate generals that have combined together to form a huge Confederate army on Cowskin Prairie. Now, Lyon is sitting in Springfield, and Lyon has got his scouts out, and one of them being Wild Bill Hickok. Hickok wasn't famous yet. He was a nobody from Nebraska at this point in Kansas. So he's got his scouts out, and they come back and basically tell, hey, you've got a big old Confederate army that's forming down here on Cowskin Prairie. And you've got one or two choices. Either you're going to have to take the fight to them before they join up, or you're going to have to skedaddle out of Springfield, because there's no way that you can stand in Springfield and defeat them. You know, if you're going to intend on securing Springfield, that's not going to happen. You either have to surprise them or you have to leave. Well, General Lyon was, unaware that the army had already combined, and he was unaware that they had already started marching up the old wire road towards Springfield. He thought they were combining. His spies had it wrong. They knew they were coming together. They did not realize they had already come together and was on their way. So he has to decide what to do. And he finally decides that he's going to attack the Southern forces before they combine. So he heads south on August 1st, has close to 6,000 troops and about 18 pieces of artillery, and heads south on the old wire road. So you've got an army coming from Springfield, a Union army. You've got a Southern army coming from Cowskin Prairie. They're going to meet like two trains on a railroad track coming at each other. Before leaving, he telegraphs Fremont one more time and says, hey, please send me some reinforcements. And Fremont says, no doing, buddy. You're on your own. So what he ends up doing is heading down the old wire road. He gets to Doug's Springs, which is about 2 miles southwest of the little town of Clever, Missouri today. And he meets up with a senior commander of the Missouri State Guard who has been sent out on kind of a reconnaissance mission. General McCulloch has sent him out and saying, hey, go on down the old wire road and see what's up there. Kind of go ahead, kind of a forward advanced party. General Rains is, in all fairness, not a very good general. He's never really had much experience. He ends up seeing quite a bit of action. He was at Carthage. He's at Doug Springs. He fights at Wilson's Creek. He's at Lexington and Pea Ridge, but he really never has very much of a good command. In fact, the case he's finally removed from his command in 1862 for drunkenness. That was a common thing, unfortunately, for Civil War leaders. Because if they saw what they saw, unfortunately, most of them drank too much because, frankly, it was a horrible job to lead your troops in the Civil War. After the war, he remained in Texas for a while, ends up dying in 1880. Well, August 2nd, Lyon reaches Doug Springs and meets up with General Rains, and they have a skirmish. General Rains has a few hundred troops. Lyon has close to 6,000. Not a battle, but there's no battle intended. Rains is routed, and he heads back to McCulloch's army on a forced march. He gets back and he says, hey, General Lyon's coming down the road. Well, first of all, McCulloch is not much of a believer in this. He has absolutely no faith in the Missouri State Militia. As I told you, he calls them real scared foragers. He said, you guys won't fight. In fact, it's just, you guys just got scared out there. This becomes known as Rains' scare. Well, he was telling the truth. Lyon's marching down the army. So McCulloch, mistaken impression is that the Missouri State Militia will not fight. At this point, he decides these guys are worthless. I can't depend on them. If there's any fighting that's going to be done, it's going to have to be done by me and my army. As it turns out, that was the last thing that happened. At the Battle of Wilson's Creek, it is actually the Missouri State Militia combined with the Arkansas State Militia that does the biggest, carries the load on the battlefield. McCulloch's army is involved, but not anywhere to the extent that Price's militia and Pierce's militia are. So Lyon continues his march south until he reaches the Stoneberry County line, about Highway 39 today. Little town of Madbury. There's actually still a sign there that says Madbury. There's not much of a town, just a few houses. But he is informed that the large Southern Army is just down the road. He doesn't think they've already combined. He thinks they're still down meeting up. All of a sudden, he realizes, I've got 13,000 soldiers a couple miles ahead of me. Folks, that's not a good situation. So he orders his army to turn around and goes back to Springfield. Takes him about 2 days on a forced march. So here's kind of a little map, as you can see here. He comes out of Springfield, passes Wilson's Creek. Present-day Republic was here, wasn't in existence at that point. Goes on down the old wire road to Doug Springs, which is south of Clever. That's where Rain Scares occurs. Heads on down the old wire road to south of Aurora, where he meets up with this large Confederate army. Well, he doesn't actually meet up. They're a few miles apart. And he turns his army around and heads back to Springfield. McCulloch, in the meantime, realizes his army's up ahead, and he takes out after him. But it's easier to move an army of 6,000 than it is to move an army of 13,000. That's one of the bad things about having a big army. The result is that Lyon makes it back to Springfield, and McCulloch makes it to Wilson's Creek. That is setting the stage for the Battle of Wilson's Creek. Now, Lyon, as I said, General McCulloch is informed that Lyon's just ahead of him, so he kind of does a forced march trying to overtake it. Lyon makes it back to Springfield by August the 6th. So McCulloch encamps at Wilson's Creek. At that point, that was about 10 miles southwest of Springfield. He's got 10,000 armed soldiers. He's got over 2,000 unarmed Missouri militia and 10 artillery pieces. This was not uncommon, folks, to have unarmed militia, and you would keep those in reserve back behind the regular army, maybe a few miles, because you knew you were going to lose soldiers. And the result was that you would have these unarmed Missouri militia come up and grab up the pieces of weapons and things off the battlefield and replace the soldiers that you had killed. That was very common in the Civil War, to have unarmed militia in reserve on the back of the battlefield. So McCulloch takes up and occupies the Edwards Cabin. Now, this is on the battlefield at Wilson's Creek today. This is not original to the battlefield. I'm really not for sure why they put this up, but this is a replica cabin of the Edwards cabin, which served as McCulloch's headquarters in the Civil War. So that's what it would have looked like, and that was kind of the cabin that was on the Civil War. Now, Lyon has a decision to make. What am I going to do? Am I going to attack? Am I going to retreat and leave Springfield? He doesn't really know what to do. He's a fighter. We've talked a little bit about Lyon. He's a hothead. He's a fighter. He's brave to the core. But he realizes he's vastly outnumbered. And so his original intention was to abandon Springfield, retreat to Rolla, and hope that Fremont would send him reinforcements. Rolla was the railhead in the Southwest Missouri. That's as far as the railroad had reached at the outbreak of the Civil War. So that was his intention. was to go to Rollo. And so he basically makes that announcement to his underlings, General Sweeney and General Franz Sigel. And he says, we're going to leave, folks. There's no way I can defeat this army. Now, if General Lyon was brave and a hothead, General Sweeney was even more so. And General Sweeney is just livid. He says, I can't believe you're doing this. I can't believe you're actually going to, basically give up Springfield without a fight, and that you're not going to engage the army. Kind of harasses Lyon a little bit that night. Basically, telling him, doesn't call him a coward, but in a sense, that's exactly what he's doing. Finally, he is able to convince Lyon to fight the battle. He says, come on, let's do it. I think we're strong enough to fight this army, and I think we can defeat them. We're an organized, well-trained army. They've got a bunch of militia. They're not really that prepared. And so the morning of August 9th, Lyon announces to his staff that he has changed his mind and that he is going to march to Wilson's Creek that night and hopefully surprise General McCulloch on the morning of August 10th and engage him in a surprise attack on the morning of August 10th. Colonel Sigel then gets into the act, the German. He gets into the act and he says, hey, why don't you let me take a few hundred troops, about 1,200, and a few artillery pieces, and do a concentric move, kind of flank the army. Let me secretly go around behind them, and we will catch General McCulloch in a pincher move. You come from the north, I'll come from the south, I'll block the old wire road so we can't retreat, and we will have him in a pincher move. That's a great idea. The only problem is that's splitting your army. So now General Lyon is only going to have about 4,200 soldiers against almost 13,000 instead of 6,000 or so. So now General Lyon has not only going to fight outnumbered, he's going to divide his force. That was not a good idea. It may have worked with a little bit of luck, but it didn't happen. So here's General Lyon again. Very brave man, not a very big man, but he was a brigadier general in the regular Union Army. This is General Sweeney. A little bit about Sweeney. He was an Irish immigrant who had come from Ireland back in the 1830s, joined up with the army, hugely decorated veteran of the Mexican War. In fact, the case, his name was Fighting Tom, because if you'll notice the picture here, he's missing an arm. He actually had an arm shot off at the Battle of Churubusco in the Mexican War. And believe it or not, he actually had a tourniquet put around his stump and continued fighting, leading his troops into battle after having an arm blown off. I mean, he was incredibly brave. And Fighting Tom Sweeney is the one that convinced Lyon to continue fighting. Believe it or not, he makes it through the war. He sees a lot of action. Fort Donelson, the Battle of Shiloh, which is one of the biggest battles of the Civil War, the Battle of Corinth. He was at the Battle of Atlanta with Sherman. He was at many of the major battles, makes it through, and ends up living to 1892. Remarkable story. I mean, the guy was injured in battle and had lost an arm in the Mexican War, fights through a lot of the major battles of the Civil War, and still lives for almost 30 years. So pretty interesting battle, pretty interesting man. Franz Sigel is the other guy we mentioned. He's the guy that convinces Lyon to let him make this pincher move, to move around to the south. Now, Franz Sigel was a German. He had come from Germany in 1848. They'd had a bunch of revolutions in 1848, and he was on the losing side. And so he had to get out of Germany. He comes to St. Louis, like a lot of Germans did. We talked about this a few weeks back. Settles in St. Louis, actually becomes the superintendent of schools in St. Louis because he's an extremely educated man. In fact, the case, he is a graduate of one of the greatest military academies in the world, a place called Karlsruhe Military Academy in Germany. There wasn't a Germany then, but he was one of those little states. Baden actually is what it was. He's extremely well trained. He knows tactics. He knows strategy up the head. I mean, this guy could absolutely, sit down on paper and make all the right moves like a chess match. The problem was he wasn't a very good fighter. He was a military genius. He just couldn't put that from paper on the action. He ended up seeing several different battles after the Battle of Wilson's Creek. He was at the Second Battle of Bull Run. He was at Newmarket, another big battle. But frankly, he was just not very good. And the only reason they kept him on was because he was really good at recruiting German soldiers. They finally end up having to get rid of him because they have to remove him from his command because he just is not a good fighter. He's a good tactician, he's a good strategist, but he's not a good fighter. So he's relieved of his command, ends up living to 1902, works as a journalist after the Civil War. So you've got General Lyon, and under him, General Sweeney and General Sigel. On the other side, you've got General McCulloch, General Price, and General Pierce. So this is the setup for the Battle of Wilson's Creek. It is the largest military engagement in the state of Missouri. It is only the second major battle of the Civil War. The first one was the Battle of Bull Run or Manassas in July, back in Pennsylvania. By the way, folks, if you don't know, the most battles in the Civil War had different names. The Union always called it near about the battle, called it usually after the name of the nearest body of water. In this case, the Battle of Bull Run was fought at Bull Run Creek. On the other hand, the southern side, the Confederates, usually called their battles after nearest village, community, city, whatever. In this case, the little village of Manassas. So the Battle of Bull Run is also the Battle of Manassas. The Battle of Wilson's Creek that's the name given to it by the Union Army. And that's the way, since the Union Army ends up winning the war, we know most of the battles by the Union name. The battle the Southerners gave it was the Battle of Oak Hills. So if you read about the Battle of Wilson's Creek in the Southern books and all, it was referred to as the Battle of Oak Hills, not the Battle of Wilson's Creek. So it was fought on August 10th, 1861, the 40th anniversary of the state of Missouri coming into the Union. It was an extremely important battle, even though it doesn't get a lot of attention in the Civil War books. I've read a lot of books about the Civil War, and I've read many articles and studied the Civil War quite a bit. And the Battle of Wilson's Creek, although it's getting a better reputation, for the most part, it's just been kind of shoved to the side. For one reason, it happened west of the Mississippi River. And most of the big battles of the Civil War occurred in Virginia and Tennessee and, in those areas there. There wasn't a lot of battles west of the Mississippi River, but it was really important. And here's the reason why. Number one, it secured the state of Missouri for the Union. Now, they had to fight the Battle of Pea Ridge the next spring in March of 1862 to make sure that was the case. But after the Battle of Wilson's Creek, there is not another threat towards bringing Missouri into the Confederacy. Technically, Missouri remains a Union state, although it becomes the place where some of the worst of the guerrilla warfare takes place. We're going to talk about this in a couple of weeks. The guerrilla warfare in Missouri was just absolutely horrible. It basically depopulated the Ozarks for all practical purposes. It was one of the bloodiest battles in the Civil War. The casualty rates at the Battle of Wilson's Creek were just incredibly high. And next week, I'm going to give you those bloody statistics. But I'll just tell you now that it was an extremely bloody battle. A lot of people lost their lives and were injured in comparison to many of the other larger battles of the Civil War. It is also an important battle because it is the first battle of the Civil War where a Union general is killed. General Nathaniel Lyon is killed in battle. And we will talk about this again next week. But that's another reason the Battle of Wilson's Creek is such an important battle. And finally, it's an important battle because even though the Confederates technically won the battle, because the Union left the battlefield in retreat, they failed to follow up. And the result was that even though the Union Army lost the battle, technically, they won in the sense that they were not pursued and not defeated. They lived on to fight another day. And the result was that even though the Battle of Wilson's Creek is technically referred to as a Confederate victory, in the long run, it was a victory for the Union. A lot of people call it what's called a Pyrrhic victory, a victory won at such great cost that you're unable to pursue the victory. So, Lyon reaches Wilson's Creek the early evening of August 9th. He's got 4,200 troops, 10 artillery pieces. He's got Sigel coming around from the south with 1,200 soldiers and 2 guns. So he secretly crept upon McCulloch. Before they left, they put burlap on the horses' hooves that were pulling the artillery pieces. They put material cloth around the wheels and greased the axles. He ordered all of his troops to march to Wilson's Creek in silence. They were going to sneak up on McCulloch's army, and they did. It worked. McCulloch is totally unaware that Lyon and Sigel have approached him. He made a huge mistake the night of August 9th. He had issued orders to march that night himself to Springfield. That was his original intent. By the way, Lyon did not come down the Old Wire Road. He came down another route to the north of the Old Wire Road. Had McCulloch done what he initially intended to do, they may have passed in the night, unawares that each other was attacking each other. But it started raining, and McCulloch decided that he wasn't going to risk the soldiers having their ammunition get wet. So he orders his army to lie on their guns. He says before they ever get off and before they ever start taking off towards Springfield, McCulloch says, okay, we'll wait till tomorrow. And he has all of his soldiers ordered to lie on their guns to keep their powder dry. Powder is kept in a paper patch. On top of that, he had removed his pickets, the outline pickets that are out there to make sure nobody creeps up on you. And he failed to put them back in place, allowing Lyon to creep up on him. That's where we set at about 5 o'clock in the morning of August the 10th, 1861. That's where we're going to pick up next week. We're going to fight the Battle of Wilson's Creek. We're going to see what happens at this huge battle southwest of Springfield. So that's it for the day. I hope you've enjoyed this. And I will make sure that we will get this battle fought next week, finally. You know, I know it seems like I've been dragging it out, but I want to make sure that you understand exactly what led up to it and what happened. So we will see you next week.
What was the other name for the Battle of Wilson Creek? Bull Run was Manassas. What was the other name for the Wilson Creek battle?
The Battle of Wilson's Creek was also known as the Battle of Oak Hills.
Okay.
Okay. So the Southerners always named it after a village or some land thing, and the Union side always named it after the nearest body of water. Generally, not always. The Battle of Shiloh was the Battle of Shiloh. Go
Very
for
good.
it.
Very
Okay.
good.